Yesterday, this quote tweet from Vettel history popped up on my timeline, and it did kind of get me thinking about Vettel at Singapore, because no driver has been as successful at the Singapore Grand Prix as Sebastian Vettel has been. 5 wins, 8 total podium finishes, 11 top 5 finishes out of the 13 races he did at Singapore, and points scored in all 12 races he finished there. 199 points in total across those 12 races, the only non-finish being 2017. Not to mention, he only started outside the top 10 here twice, in 2016 and 2022. Well, let's take a slightly deeper dive into Sebastian Vettel at the Singapore Grand Prix, because, well, why not? Why not make my first video of 2024 all about Seb Vettel? Well, okay, second video actually. No thanks to Sauber on that one. What was your favourite Sebastian Vettel moment at the Singapore Grand Prix, by the way? Let me know down in the comments below. Vettel was on the grid for the first ever Singapore Grand Prix back in 2008, which frankly at this point is just remembered for Renault trying to essentially play God. But Vettel was at the time driving for Toro Rosso in his first full season in the sport, and fresh off the back of his first pole and first race win at the previous round in Monza. He would qualify a really good 7th position at the inaugural Singapore Grand Prix, though he would start 1 place higher in 6th due to a 3-place grid penalty for Nick Heidfeld. But after all the craziness with what would later become known as Crashgate, he would go on to finish 1 place higher than he started in P5, which is 1 place lower than where he would finish in 2009. Now driving for Red Bull, he would slide backwards from 2nd on the grid to 4th at the checkered flag. The German had spent a while kind of challenging up the front for the race lead, however, that came to an end after he 1, got floor damage from hitting a curb, and then 2, got the drive-through penalty after he'd been found to have been speeding in the pit lane, leading to his 4th place finish. But in 2010, things would go a lot better for Vettel. He started 2nd for the 2nd year in a row, behind championship rival Fernando Alonso. Vettel kept on Alonso the whole race and was pushing him the entire time, but the eventual 2010 world champion would have to settle for 2nd place in the end, though it was his first ever podium finish in Singapore, and he was only a matter of tenths behind Alonso across the finish line, who had won the race with what would be Ferrari's last Grand Slam for about 11.5 years. After 2 P2 starts in a row, he would finally snag his first of 4 pole positions in Singapore in 2011, a race which saw Jenson Button as his main challenger for victory. Button would claim fastest lap, but that along with his P2 is where he would have to settle for, as Vettel hung on and after 61 laps crossed the finish line in P1 for his first ever race victory at the Marina Bay Street Circuit, and also to put himself within touching distance of his 2nd world championship, which he would go on to claim at the next race in Japan with a P2 finish, by the way. 2012 would see a 2nd consecutive Singapore Grand Prix win for the German driver, and also the first time this race was won, not only from off the front row, but also from off pole position when Renault doesn't get involved. So, you know, the first time it had been won off the front row and off pole position, not including 2008, when, as I said earlier, Renault decided to play God. Vettel instead started doing in P3 behind Maldonado and Hamilton, the latter of which had car problems for the 5 millionth time that season, which Vettel took prime advantage of to gain the race lead, which he would not let go of and win the race by 9 seconds, a score which by the end of the season would prove to be a crucial 10 more points scored than his title rival Alonso, who finished down in P3. Maldonado also did have car problems too, but Vettel was already well past him by then. But 2013 though, I'm not saying this was his overall best Singapore Grand Prix drive. It definitely is a candidate for that, but I'll get into that topic at the end of which one I think was his best. But 2013 was without question not only Vettel's most dominant Singapore Grand Prix weekend, but one of his most dominant weekends of his entire Formula 1 career. He led practice 2 and 3, finishing P3 in practice 1, and while he did not have the quickest time in Q1, he did in Q2, and then in Q3, he claimed pole position with just 1 lap. While everybody else was out on track, setting their final runs at the end of the session, Vettel was out of the car, stood in his garage with his mechanics, basically watching himself claim pole position. He wouldn't let go of that P1 position on Sunday either, as he led from the start and, well, did not look back, as he'd go on to claim the 3rd Grand Slam of his career, having led every lap from pole and won with the fastest lap as well. And the gap to P2 man Fernando Alonso? 32.6 seconds. And you know, there was a safety car in the middle of the race, and in fact the gap was 22 seconds with 4 laps to go. He gained 10 seconds in 4 laps. He dominated on his way to his 3rd Singapore Grand Prix win. The streak of consecutive Singapore wins would end here, however, as come 2014, Mercedes had become the dominant force, and that continued in Singapore as Hamilton won the race from pole position, whilst his teammate's car essentially said, nah, fuck this shit, I'm out. But as for Vettel, he qualified P4, but thanks to Rosberg's problems, he was P3 right off the start behind his teammate Daniel Ricciardo, who he would manage to leapfrog pretty early into the race to eventually go on to finish P2. And not by much though, the Red Bulls were separated by less than a second over the line. But while not a race win, I mean, okay, this was 2014, and if you weren't driving a Mercedes or if your name wasn't Daniel Ricciardo, then you were out of luck in terms of getting a win. It was still P2, and that's a strong way to end off his final Singapore Grand Prix in the Red Bull family. As for 2015, as we all know, Vettel had shifted over to Ferrari, and in terms of the turbo hybrid era, this weekend was, in my opinion, a pretty significant one, as this weekend saw, at the hands of Sebastian Vettel, the first ever non-Mercedes powered pole position of the turbo hybrid era. In fact, Mercedes this weekend were a bit like Red Bull at Singapore last year, 2023. They just weren't up there like they usually are. But Vettel took full advantage of this blip from Mercedes to lead away from pole position, and despite an interruption from a fan deciding to get a bit too close to the action, he would convert that pole into his 4th Singapore Grand Prix win and his 3rd win of the season, and not to mention his 6th straight podium at Singapore. Vettel would after the race go on to dub it as one of his best races, and I wonder if he would still think that and say that 8 and a bit years later. But 2016, it wasn't a podium or even a win at the end, and it was the first time Vettel would start the race outside the top 10, as he'd started last after problems in qualifying and then subsequent grid penalties, but frankly he qualified last anyways thanks to those problems, so those penalties was like pouring water over yourself when you're in a pool already. But this race was, in my opinion, it's another candidate for his best performance at Singapore, as he would go from 22nd at lights out to 5th at the checkered flag after a brilliant comeback drive through the field. It's better than how 2017 went, for damn sure. 2017 was his sole DNF in Singapore, and we all came what happened there. That and Japan in the following race, it was when the championship challenge fell apart for Seb. So ignoring 2017, basically, 2018 would be much better for him. Not in terms of the championship challenge, but in terms of he would start and finish inside the top 3, as he would finish where he qualified in 3rd position for a 7th Singapore podium. He was like 30 seconds behind P2, but a podium is a podium. 2019, however, we're back in the land of candidates for Vettel's best Singapore Grand Prix. He again started P3, directly behind his teammate Leclerc, who was on his 3rd straight pole position after 2 consecutive wins. And what was Vettel's response to his young teammate's strong run of form and overtaking him in the championship? By putting in an incredible outlap after his pit stop, which came before Leclerc, who pitted the lap after him, and gained the net race lead, which later became the actual race lead, which he would not let go of. Singapore is one of those tracks where strategy and track position really matter, because it is, after all, a street circuit. And on this day in history, the strategy really played a big role for Vettel to be able to leapfrog Leclerc, who was understandably a bit pissed in the moment, given he was the lead Ferrari on track. I'm sure he'd have been expecting to have been boxed first or given preferential strategy or whatever, but at the end of the day, that's not what happened, and I think Ferrari maybe also didn't expect the undercut to be so powerful, but either way, Vettel had a stunning outlap and gained about 3.5, 4 seconds or so. As I said, the strategy really helped him here, but Vettel did still have to put in the outlap. And honestly, that strong outlap, it would not only lead to his 5th and final Singapore Grand Prix win and his 8th and final Singapore podium, but little did we know at the time this would be Sebastian Vettel's 53rd and final race victory in Formula 1. A pretty damn fine final race victory as well, if you ask me. He had only one more Singapore Grand Prix after this in 2022, ahead of his retirement at the end of the season, which saw his 2nd start from outside the top 10, where he qualified 14th, but lined up 13th due to George Russell starting from the pit lane, for reasons which I cannot fucking remember. I'm gonna be honest, half the time George Russell just ends up flying under the freaking radar for me. But throughout the chaos of that race, Seb managed to climb up and finish in P8, which was the German's only non top 5 point score in Singapore. But now let's just have one final quick run through the stats of Seb in Singapore, then I'll get to which of these years I think was Vettel's best at Singapore. In total, Sebastian Vettel competed in 13 Singapore Grand Prix, and one of those was a DNF. He had 0 finishes outside of the points, and he had 12 finishes inside the points. Of those 12 points finishes, only one of those was outside the top 5, and 11 of those was inside the top 5. Of those 11 top 5 finishes, 8 of them were podium finishes, and of those 8 podiums, 5 of them were race wins, and he scored a total of 199 points in Singapore. He also had 1 fastest lap and 4 poles. Now, which Singapore race/weekend was Vettel's best here? Well, as I've said through the video, it's kind of, in my opinion, between 2013, 2016 and 2019. And there's a strong case for each of them. In 2013, it was complete and utter domination. In 2016, it was a really great drive back through the field from last to the top 5. And 2019 was an overall stellar performance to win the race. And a note on 2019, to this day, that was only the 3rd time this race has been won from off the front row. Again, not including Renault playing God in 2008. 4th including 2008, but okay, let's be real. I feel like Alonso winning from 15th at the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix is always going to have an asterisk beside it. Because let's be real, Alonso would not have won that race without Crashgate. But as for Vettel, it's close between them. You could make an argument for any of these years, or even 2015, or 2011, or 2012, say. But it is difficult to look beyond 2013, leading 2 of the 3 practice sessions, topping 2 of the 3 qualifying segments, pole with just 1 lap in Q3 to boot, fastest lap and race win by 32.6 seconds after leading every single lap. He did have a monster of a car, yeah, but it is kind of down to the driver when they have a car like that to get everything out of it. And he did that weekend at Marina Bay in 2013. But what do you think? Which year would you say was Vettel's best/most impressive Singapore Grand Prix to you? And what was your favourite moment of Seb in Singapore? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Drop a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe if you're new around here. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.